Yo, what up, everybody? It's your boy Carson Fox with another edition of Fox on West Virginia Mountaineer Sports. And with it being July 1st, fall camp starting up on the last day of the month, we have to get serious. Big 12 Media Days coming up next week, talking about some of the projected starters for this team, a team that might be on the cusp of making the top 25 national rankings. We're going to have a lot to talk about here with this 2024 team here over the course of the next month or so. So, with that being said, I wanted to take this moment today, the last time, to really have something fun to break down West Virginia related. And what I wanted to do for this video, you see these a lot of times in the slowest part of the season, but now there is no slow part of the season. There's always something to talk about, as you can see here with this channel, is ranking West Virginia's quarterbacks of the last 20 years. So I'm going to go 2003 to 2023. And where I think I really have a good perspective of this of these 20 years is I've lived it. So not only did I see or attend in person many of these games that I'm going to talk about and all of these players, but I would say it's at a time and place of my life, and with the invention of this channel, YouTube, that you can go back and you can watch individual games, performances, unlimited highlights, so unlike you could decades prior. So that's what's great is for a lot of these players, I did for these rankings go back and watch some old games just to kind of refresh my memory and talk about some of these things. So really hard, and I kind of have a like subjective, not necessarily formula or rankings on any which way, but what I was talking when I kind of broke this down of how I wanted to incorporate these rankings and where the players get slotted, I was taking into consideration wins plus big wins. So anytime some team was ranked or just was it a big environment, big spot, something on the line, something important. Of course, there's statistics. Got to take that into consideration. I would say the importance that player played on those teams in each individual years, respectively, incorporating their intangibles quality, but also ability. So this isn't necessarily to say that we're ranking these if you're taking one game necessarily, and I might reference that. I might say this again. If you're taking one quarterback to win a game, who are you taking as the best quarterback, the best passer, the best runner, the best mental processor, so on and so forth? It's all of that kind of wrapped up in one. So it's very hard to do this, and I also wanted to go with quarterbacks who started 8 games or more. So sorry, Adam Bednarik. Sorry, Paul Millard. Sorry, Ford Childress. You're not making this list, unfortunately. No, sorry, Chris Chuginov. No, thank you. Even though he came in and played admirably as best he could there at the end of that 2017 season, but none of those guys making this list. So anybody who started 8 games or more for West Virginia over the last 20 years, I'm going to break it down for you from quarterback number 11, and I'm going to work my way back to 1. So if you want to seek forward here and go all the way to 1 and listen to it back that way, I'm going to start from worst, quote unquote, to first. And I think you all kind of can get an idea of who's going to be number 1. Really, the top 3 is pretty obvious, but, I want to get into the complexities of each. So, number 11, and this player kind of falls in the same tier as player number 10. Number 11, I'm putting Austin Kendall, who went 3-6 as starter for the 2019 team, with really only one nice win being the NC State 44-27 victory in Morgantown, a game in which I was able to attend. Awesome crowd that day, awesome weather. West Virginia finally, after getting pummeled the week prior against Missouri, put a rushing offense together laterally with Sam James and had a highlight reel run in that for a game for a touchdown. NC State was pretty down. They only really had like a tight end who was a pretty good skill position player for him, not that notable of a quarterback. But enough about that game. So Kendall, 61.5% completion percentage on 304 attempts in 9 games. 1,989 passing yards, 12 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. What I would say was the downfall of Austin Kendall's time at West Virginia is I think he did suffer an injury that went undisclosed, or to the extent of it was never made mention, in that Missouri game. That was a debacle. 38-7 on the road. Neil Brown's second game after just barely beating James Madison the week before in the home opener. Kendall playing behind that offensive line that consisted of Colton McKivitz and a whole bunch of scrubs, with a team that was going through a completely culture shock, coming from Dana Holgerson to Neil Brown, Kenny Robinson, Marcus Sims, your two upperclassmen leaders, not a part of the team because of the great academic unknown scandal of the summer of 2019. And it was really when Kendall couldn't power West Virginia's offense to a victory behind what was an incredible standout defensive performance. You can think back to Darius Stills in that game. At number 12 Baylor on Halloween night, Baylor winning that game 17-14. But then the next week, the WVU defense just completely mutinied the West Virginia offense in its matchup against Texas Tech at home. You can remember Jet Duffy just running all over West Virginia, throwing all over West Virginia. Mountaineer fans were just stunned how one player of one team in Texas Tech had was taking a no prisoners attitude, just crushed West Virginia. And I think that really forced Neil Brown's hand to go to Jarrett Deggy, who then became WVU's starter for the final 3 weeks. And it was a good decision, ending that 2019 campaign on a high, at Kansas State getting a win 20-13. Getting a win against Kansas State, losing to a ranked Oklahoma State team 20-13 in a game that was an inch difference on a call, with Sam James getting into the end zone from being a game that could have went potentially to overtime, and then winning on the road at TCU. So what I would say was Kendall's saving grace was the 2020 Liberty Bowl. His performance against Army replaced a really poor playing Jarrett Deggy in that game. He goes 8 of 17 for 121 passing yards and 2 touchdowns en route to West Virginia's 24-21 victory. So Austin Kendall thought of more favorably in the minds of Mountaineer fans because of that finale. But really, I'm putting him at the very end of the totem pole here for the quarterbacks of the last 20 years. So in a vacuum with him, I'm going number 10, JT Daniels. Again, also, like Kendall, 3-6 as starter for the 2022 West Virginia team that really only had 2 nice wins, I would say, with Daniels as starter, that being at Virginia Tech, bringing the Black Diamond Trophy back home to Morgantown, where it should stay for a very long time until the Turkeys want to play the Mountaineers again. And then in a home game, I was able to attend that Baylor game, a Thursday night contest, in which West Virginia won 43-40, that really, I think, saved Neil Brown's job at that point in time. Going back-to-back years potentially of 2-4, West Virginia had to have that win, hasn't lost to Baylor in Morgantown. So Daniels coming up with, and it wasn't necessarily all because of Daniels. There was a lot of things in both of those games, particularly the run game against Virginia Tech, and then Baylor, a couple of turnovers forced really changed the complexion in that contest. I think it was a turnover, the Sean Martin fumble recovery or forced fumble, and then Jasir Cox coming away with that, I think it was a field goal block or something that game. But anyway, back about Daniels, just a 61.2 per completion percentage on 327 attempts in 10 games. 2107 passing yards, 13 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. So what I really say for Daniels, and I'll stick by with this, is the downfall for him was that backyard brawl loss, because that changed the whole complexion of the season. That hangover from week 1 to week 2, in which West Virginia then lost to an upstart Kansas program at home in overtime, just in starting at that season 0-2. Tremendously hard schedule. I think the 3rd hardest schedule in the history, according to Sports Reference, schedule of West Virginia football. That changed the whole complexion of the season. And by the Texas game, there were a couple of drops on his first 2 offensive series, and Texas was just running rampant over the West Virginia defense. I think it was during that game that he just lost all confidence. having kind of like a Geno Smith 2012 syndrome of, oh, I have to score every single time our offense is on the field or our defense is just going to get run over. So, he got into his head. I think he was a little more injured than what we were led on by the end of the season. His mechanics went to shit, and then he just completely fell apart. So I wish for JT Daniels that had just few things gone differently, and also for Mountaineer fans, I wish for them too, myself included, that would have won that backyard brawl game. How would that 2022 season play out? So going on next, I think so, kind of just out of that tier above, but still in the the lowest tier possible of all the quarterbacks the last 20 years. I'm putting Jarrett Brown, who played 25 games between 2006 to 2008, backing up Pat White with the magical 3 overtime victory versus number 13 Rutgers in 2006 when Pat White was injured on a cold December 2nd night game at Mountaineer Field. One of the most legendary games of the last 20 years. I feel like it goes completely forgotten about. Brown really became the full-time starter for the Mountaineers in 2009 when West Virginia went 9-4. We talk about how big of a deal it was for West Virginia to go 9-4 this past year. Well, 9-4 was a disappointment coming off of how good West Virginia was really at the start of the early 2000s, then peaking in 2007, and then in a Big East that was really coming apart at the seams at that point in time. So, but once Pat White graduated, Jarrett Brown, I feel like, was the first true victim of offensive coordinator Jeff Mullen and his offense that went from what was a spread read option attack to the pro I-form set, which was ultimately the doom of Bill Stewart's career as head coach. For Brown, 63% completion percentage on 296 attempts in 13 games. For 2,144 passing yards, did have 466 rushing yards, 17 total touchdowns with 9 interceptions. I think the real highlight of that 2009 season was WVU's upset 19-16 win in the backyard brawl at home when Pitt was ranked top 10 in the country. But Brown really wasn't very good in that game. If you look at the numbers, it was Noel Devine who really saved the Mountaineers. And, of course, the walk-off kick by Tyler Bittenkurt. West Virginia never really looked competitive in that 33-21 bowl game loss to Bobby Bowden's Florida State Seminoles in his last game as coach in the Gator Bowl. So I'll really remember Brown for 3 things. 1, the Rutgers win in 2006. That's what's really, I think, cements his legacy. Number 2, how his final season, which should have been his best season, was stifled because of Jeff Mullen's uncreative, delusional offense. And then number 3, really being the bridge from Pat White to Geno Smith. So kind of forgotten about in the annals of West Virginia football history, Jarrett Brown. So now the next tier up, kind of your mid, I'm going to say 8, honestly, through about 4. And this one might be controversial because who's going to follow at 7? And I'm putting Garrett Green. I think Garrett Green's legacy at West Virginia is incomplete as of right now. I could see Garrett Green finishing as high as 4, maybe even 3 on this list, depending upon how this year goes. If this results in a Big 12 Conference Championship title game appearance or better, and they make the college football playoff, shoo, he's shooting up this list. But he only technically, and I say this technically, played in 10.5 games last year. If you're counting just half of Duquesne, missing the Texas Tech game, missing pretty much the whole Pitt game, you're looking at just too small of a sample size just yet. We got to look at that second year too. So I got to give him the credit for all the credit in the world for that 2022 victory over Oklahoma at Mountaineer Field. Huge for his legacy already. But really, what win last year? I know in totality, looking at the complete 2023 season, what really was great for the whole team. But what is Garrett Green's best win out of that 23 season? Is it TCU? Is it USCF? Is it North Carolina? No ranked victories. So, obviously for him, why I feel like he has the propensity and ability is the ability that he has, his talent. I mean, looking at his numbers, just on 277 attempts. So, as I just mentioned, as I talked about with Jarrett Brown threw 20 more attempts than Garrett Green did last year. So, it's crazy when you think about it. 2,406 passing yards, 772 rushing yards, 29 touchdowns, and just 4 interceptions. Now, the completion percentage, due to a number of factors, the boom or bust downfield passing attack that West Virginia has deployed with its ground and pound game, and some of the inconsistencies that Green had with his wide receivers, I would say up until about the Cincinnati Baylor game. Once you got past Oklahoma, we saw a completely different Garrett Green. I know he lit the world on fire against Houston when he finally had some, motivation to go fast and play fast, which was totally foreign up to that point in the season for Neil Brown, wanting to win a very slow, control the clock, play good defense kind of way. And then it totally flipped the script in the Houston game. So completely different. I mean, he played great in that TCU game, so I'm not going to take anything away from him in that one. But, if Garrett Green continues on the same trajectory as he had over the course of that last half of 2023 into 24, and the sky's the limit. So that's what I'm saying is why he's at 8 right now is there's more to be had. So that's why I say you're going to get mad when I say number 7. Right now I'm putting Jarret Doege. I would never take – I am last in line of the Jarret Doege fan club. I truly am. I would never take in a win, like a game that depends upon my life, Jarret Doege over Garrett Green. But Jarret Doege has 3 years worth of a career that we can take a look at for this. But Jarret Doege ultimately was really a 2 to 3 star caliber player in an identity-less offense with holes at different talent positions, skill positions, and most importantly, the offensive line. There were holes everywhere, and a coach who was really trying to manage a Power 5 program while being an on-field coach in the Big 12, dealing with COVID and dealing with the evolution of NIL and the transfer portal, which had just been brand new. So for the bulk of Jarret Doege's career. So what I'll say for the positives for Jarret Doege is, I think most importantly, we got to remember the way that, and this is what I hope fans will remember of him in good graces, would be the way that he finished the 2019 season. Those 3 games that I talked about, the at Kansas State victory, going to the wire with Oklahoma State, and then beating TCU. In 2020, West Virginia did beat, I completely forgot, forgot about this game. In 2020, West Virginia did beat a number 16 ranked Kansas State 37-10 under Jarret Doege's leadership, and gave number 22 Texas all it wanted in a 17-13 loss, in which if West Virginia would have got a call in the end zone against Longhorns, again, we're leaving the Big 12 for the SEC Longhorns, who maybe West Virginia would have got that call, totally different if Doege wins in Austin for that game. And then, of course, in 2021, having 2 ranked wins. Now the negatives. Him falling apart in that 2020 Liberty Bowl, thank God for Austin Kendall coming in at the very end and saving that to get a victory against Army. The Maryland game, a game that I very much rehash because I got a scar an arm deep from that Maryland game in College Park. And he takes most of the responsibility, I feel like, for that contest. Almost throwing away the Virginia Tech game at home in front of that home crowd. If it wasn't for Mountaineer Nation willing that defense to victory, West Virginia would have lost. So, because of the way that it almost ended there in the fourth quarter. And then really I would also say the angst against Jarret Doege being in the way of Garrett Green's development. I mean, someone's got to get truth serum for Neil Brown to talk about that era of 2020 into 2022 and why at 2-4 after you just got pummeled by Baylor with a bye week coming up, West Virginia, Neil Brown didn't think behind a terrible offensive line, let's go to a mobile quarterback and let him run wild. But then what does Jarrett Deggy do? He has the game, a ranked victory against Iowa State at home. Then falls apart. Again, a couple of games. Thought you would go to Garrett Green at that point in time. No, sticks with him at Texas, and they beat Texas at home. Oh, crap. Then he finishes off terribly against Oklahoma State, and you're like, okay, well, maybe for the bowl game, especially when you can't move 2 inches against this Minnesota defense in that guaranteed late bowl in Phoenix, Arizona. And Brown never went to him and stuck with Deggy as he just got pounded and pounded by the Golden Gophers defense. So, ultimately for his career, if you look at the numbers, 65% completion percentage on 911 attempts for 6,453 yards passing with 40 touchdowns and 19 interceptions. That's why I got to give Deggy more credit than I do guys like Kendall, Daniels, Jarrett Brown. And right now, with what he compiled over 3 years, 2.5-ish in Morgantown, right now above. If Garrett Green never played another down for West Virginia, I got to give Deggy just the slight edge in totality of career, even though I would never take him over Garrett Green. Number 6. This gets interesting here with these next few quarterbacks. I go Clint Trickett. And it took me some analysis and another quarterback who I also very much had a distaste for with the way I felt about Deggy. I liked Clint Trickett. And I bet both Clint Trickett and Dana Holgorsen would want a redo with Clint Trickett's college career. Obviously starting out playing for his dad at who was the offensive line coach at Florida State, going there, transferring. Before transferring was really, a cool thing for the 2013 season after Geno Smith had graduated and went to the NFL. But 2013 was a mess, as we all recall, the worst, or 4-8, worst season West Virginia's had, this century. And at quarterback, it was no better. Of a mess. Ford Childress coming in is really Dana Holgorsen's, prodigy, but, couldn't handle his liquor on High Street, apparently. Paul Millard was just a guy who was like a 2-star, probably should have played at Stephen F. Austin. I think he might have been a transfer from Stephen F. Austin. And then there was Trickett, who, just coming in, you didn't know whether it was too soon to turn to Childress. He played part of that Maryland game and looked terrible. Eventually washed out. It wasn't really until, as we all know, that number 11 Oklahoma State win, 30-21 on homecoming, that it was finally Trickett's team, you felt like. But still, West Virginia, over the next 7 games, lost 6, including at Kansas and home against Iowa State, who were bottom feeders in all of college football at that point in time. So 2013, you didn't have any confidence in anybody, for 2020 or 2014. I felt like maybe a little bit into Trickett, but I wasn't that much of a believer, especially with Charles Sims, who was everything for that 2013 going to the NFL. So 2014 finally, West Virginia turns a corner. After what was a down 2012 season after winning the Orange Bowl, terrible 13-year, back up. In its showing against Alabama in that Chick-fil-A kickoff in which Kevin White broke onto the national scene. West Virginia beats Maryland on a walk-off field goal. Kevin White also awesome in that game. It just seemed like Trickett to White, and then with a Mario Alford on the side, especially on special teams. West Virginia rips off 4 wins in a row, including what still is their biggest win as part of the Big 12, beating number 4 Baylor at home. Bryce Petty, they took it to him. I can't recall outside of that another top 5 win of my lifetime. I'd have to find those details, or especially before I started really to I was at an age where I could follow West Virginia. So that was such an underrated, unexpected, fantastic performance, both offensively and defensively. Just completely shocked Baylor. But then the season deflates against TCU, a game that was poorly officiated, but also poorly played by the Mountaineers. I had to go back and watch the highlights, and it was just terrible, terrible time turnovers. And then when West Virginia needed a first down, with just a few minutes left on the clock, just needed one first down to seal that game, what do you know? They blow it. Can't get a first down, punt it back. TCU trots right down the field, chip shot, field goal, game over. And that really derailed the season, because I think that's when Trickett suffered what was ultimately like his last or second to last concussion. West Virginia loses the next 2 weeks at Texas and then against Kansas State in very closely competed games. 7-5 becomes 7-6 with a loss to Texas A&M in the Liberty Bowl, 45-37. Cold, nasty game, and Trickett's wearing a headset because he's dealing with concussion symptoms. So ultimately for the year, high completion percentage, 67% on 419 attempts, 3,285 yards passing, 18 touchdowns, but did have 10 picks. And that's what I think, at least for me, I forgot. And when comparing with the player I'm going to talk about next, is I think we forget Clint Trickett was a bit of a turnover machine. And I think ultimately, if Clint Trickett were a little bigger, I mean, like, you just look at some of his old highlights, and it's just like, ooh, you kind of worry about Garrett Green and some of the shots that he takes. But to me, Garrett Green seems a little bit more like built like a tank. Like Clint Trickett was just a string bean, and taller, longer arms, longer legs. At least with Garrett Green, yeah, he's short, yeah, but he just he looks as if he can take a hit stick hit a little bit better than what Clint Trickett can. I wonder what Clint Trickett weighed whenever he was playing, because if he would have been able to hold up a little bit better, it was just could have put on a little bit more weight, I think he would have even had a better career. But again, he was put in a lot of situations by Dana Holgorsen to have to go out and make plays out there, and put himself on the line. So getting crushed like that. But I want to go on, because I feel like I'm going to have a lot of debate here. And I was even debating if before I wanted to make this video, I had Clint Trickett higher than this next player, but had to move him up after further analysis. And that's what I mean. Number 5, Skylar Howard. If I'm taking one quarterback to win me a game, to use that example I talked about at the onset, I'm going Clint Trickett. Especially if we're talking same offenses. 2015 or 16 for Howard and 14 for Clint Trickett. I'm taking Clint Trickett and Kevin White and all the time. But look at Skylar Howard, and people sometimes will be posting memes on social media about, you were the king that we never realized at that point in time, especially during, I feel like 2019 up until about, this year. Like, oh, these sob stories, be still my beating heart about Skylar Howard and how great you are, and we didn't, appreciate you the way we're. Like, I looked at and it's confirmed. I thought I knew this off the top of my head, but after looking on second confirmation, Skylar Howard didn't have a ranked win in either 2015 or 2016. So forget about it. He did beat Texas twice. And that's what I'm going to give him credit for, especially in 2016. But I went back and watched those highlights, and Howard wasn't good. He almost cost West Virginia in that 2016 game. It was the defense that played phenomenally. Actually, both contests. In 2015, we can recall that was the year West Virginia goes 8-5, but finishes off with a Cactus Bowl victory. Howard to David Sills, game ender in the desert. West Virginia comes away with a bowl victory, for the first time since the Orange Bowl. 2016, they go 10-3, but they lose to Miami in the Champ Sports Bowl. And you look at both years' numbers, it was just about the same, I would say, in totality. 55% completion percentage on 403 attempts, 3,145 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, 14 interceptions, 157 rush attempts, 502 yards, and 6 touchdowns. 61% completion percentage on 404 attempts, 3,328 yards passing, 26 touchdowns, 10 picks, 142 rush attempts for 463 yards, and 10 touchdowns. So what I would say is just so frustrating for me in looking back on the career of Skylar Howard was where his ceiling was that he could beat you if he had a great defense in a home performance against TCU in which he outduels Kenny Hill, Kenny Trill, Kenny Thrill, whatever you called him at that point in time. But especially against the Oklahoma schools, that Oklahoma State game will forever in my mind just like haunt me. That Skylar Howard could not win that game against the Cowboys when they had so much momentum, and then get blown out, especially at home. I know that wasn't necessarily all on Howard. I mean, defense just didn't show up against Baker Mayfield in that offense. But that 2016 season, did play great against BYU. But it's BYU. Like, the West Virginia was on the precipice, it seemed like, building. Clint Trickett having his 2 years ascending, 15, okay, competitive, okay, everyone's saying, as the second-year starter in a Dana Holgorsen offense, Skylar Howard will be so much better come the next year. And you look at the numbers, and he really wasn't. And then by the end, in that Miami Bowl game, he was playing hero ball, and just everything was going to go through him. And that's why West Virginia lost to the Hurricanes. Because Skylar Howard thought he was Tim Tebow out there and tried to run through everybody. And it cost West Virginia, unfortunately. So you look at the numbers. I give them those Texas wins, especially the one in Austin. Like, that's got to mean for something. Like, comparing Trickett's Oklahoma State win and Baylor win are two bigger wins, obviously, than Howard had. But he had a bowl win. And that was, at that point in time where bowl games, even though it was a lesser bowl, West Virginia hasn't had the greatest bowl record in all of its history. So still meant something to beat Arizona State in Phoenix. And, a late night game and going out there and beating them. And then getting to 10 wins, which West Virginia hasn't done since, that one 2016 season. So the victories that pile up, a bowl win, the stats, compile all that together, and I got to put Skylar Howard above Clint Trickett, given what comparatively side by side. So in a vacuum, those are those two. The next one, I think there might be some heavy debate between. I'm going number 4 is Rasheed Marshall. As John the Baptist was to Jesus Christ, Rasheed Marshall was the forerunner for Pat White. Rasheed Marshall walked so Pat White could run. White was what Rich Rodriguez wanted Marshall to be, and Marshall gave West Virginia all that he had in his ability, but it was just way too inconsistent. That's the consistency that Pat gave you. I look at 2002, 9-4, the game I went to, lost. This is one of the first memories I feel like I have of West Virginia football. I think I was like 8 or 9. 2002, losing to Virginia in the Continental Tire Bowl in Charlotte, North Carolina. But 2002, Marshall and West Virginia won as a sophomore starter at Virginia Tech, beats Pitt, who was a ranked team. 2003, 8-5, lost to Maryland in the Gator Bowl. Hate losing to those Terps. But you beat a number 3 ranked Virginia Tech. Fantastic game. Goes down in the lore of West Virginia football history. And once again, beat the Panthers. So Larry Fitzgerald never beats West Virginia in his 2-year career, 2002 to 2003. And then 2004, another game I feel like just completely gets forgotten about. But that 0-4 win against Maryland at home with Sean Merriman defensively, and I think Vernon Davis at tight end for the Twerps. West Virginia beats them in overtime. Chris Henry touchdown victory. 8-4 lost to FSU in the Gator Bowl. I'm going to get into that year in just a second. So you look at his numbers for the career, just a 54% completion percentage on 702 attempts over 42 games. So do the quick math on that, and he was throwing somewhere in the ballpark of around maybe 15 passes a game, maybe, for Rashid, but still had 5,098 yards and 1,863 yards rushing on 452 attempts. So he was running the ball, 40%, 30-some percent, as much as he was passing the ball in Rich Rod's offense. 66 total touchdowns to 23 picks. That's what hurt him. Now, Rasheed Marshall was a phenomenal athlete, bigger than Pat, not as big or not as fast as Pat. I would think, like, I'd love to see a quarterback competition of those guys in their prime, because both quarterbacks are known for their running more predominantly than their passing. So I'm going to give like the benefit of the doubt there to whoever was the coaches who could see them comparatively. That's not something that's ever really talked about. But for this, when West Virginia, what I'll say ultimately about Marshall was when West Virginia needed him to be a better quarterback, especially a passer, it was the inconsistency. And the way that he ended his career, similarly to some of these other quarterbacks that I've mentioned, 36-17 loss at number 21 Boston College when West Virginia was 7-1, nationally ranked. It was a ranked-on-ranked game for a chance to win the Big East championship when the Big East was, right there. I know 2004 was the last year for Boston College, Miami, and Virginia Tech. Then West Virginia loses in another game I was at, the coldest I've ever been in my entire life. The Backyard Brawl, Thanksgiving night at Heinz Field, 04, 16-13, Tyler Palco, and the Kitties come away with a victory. And then that 04 season ended on a down note, 30-18 loss in the Gator Bowl to Florida State. So really not a magical end by any means where, we're having like Pat White had, a senior send-off game. Rasheed Marshall really didn't necessarily get that. So I think that's sometimes why Marshall gets forgotten about. And we talk about guys like Skylar Howard, potentially. I'm not saying me, but Mountaineer fans in general might speak of higher regard for Howard, or maybe even Clint Trickett, than you would of Rasheed Marshall. But 5 ranked wins, and everything that he meant for that program at that time, he was incredibly important, even with some awesome backs around him. Avon Coburn, especially in 2002. But even like guys like KJ Harris was phenomenal. Quincy Wilson had maybe the best run behind Major Harris in West Virginia history in that game against Miami. Like, so close. He was so close. That's why I said he was the forerunner for Pat White. So I put him at number 4 on this list. Number 3, and this is also a character, player just like Clint Trickett, who I feel like would want a redo as a Mountaineer in his 2 years, and that's Will Grier. Off the charts ability, I think right up there alongside Geno Smith as the best pure passers of the last 20 years of West Virginia football. Definitely a better passer than White. Didn't have the running ability, and then just the intangibles that White brought you. But 2017 was an awesome year. And he was the most important player, I feel like, of arguably any team in the country. Because if West Virginia in 2017 didn't have Will Grier, if it was another year of Skylar Howard, to play a super senior year, potentially a COVID year, he doesn't have the kind of year. In 2017, I feel like was peak Will Grier. Better than 2018, which I'll talk about in just a second. He gave, if you watch back that Virginia Tech game, he gave everything he had. First game in a Mountaineer uniform, missed out on an entire 2016 season because of, the steroid false test or whatever that he got kicked out of Florida for under Jim McElwain. Comes to Morgantown, and everyone's pretty much waiting for the 2016 season to be over to get to Will Grier. Prophesied as the next, Geno Smith. but gave everything in that loss against Virginia Tech and Washington, D.C. He gets screwed, and West Virginia gets screwed on that last drive. Offensive pass interference call against David Sills at TCU in a game, the call still maddening to me. The miraculous comeback West Virginia had against Texas Tech, who was ranked on homecoming, wins at Baylor, I think it was a Halloween Thursday night game, 38-36. But then loses to Oklahoma State in a nationally televised game between him and Mason Rudolph, and looks really bad in that rainy, nasty game in Morgantown, 50-39. But then they beat number 14 Iowa State 20-16 in that contest. But then the next week against Texas, breaks his finger, and that was it. I was at that game. I've never seen the life out of Mountaineer Field just get sucked out. I mean, well, I don't know. There was an odd feeling to 07 against Pitt. I was there. There was an odd, eerie feeling coming into that game. It was almost more of an anxiousness, and more so than there was electricity, mixed with a touch of complacency, the way that UConn game ended the week prior. I think there was some some forecasting, some thinking ahead. There's no doubt that there was in that 2007 matchup against Pitt. There definitely was. But when Will Grier broke his finger against Texas, in what was, if West Virginia beats Texas that year, they could have potentially won the Big 12. There was still some more to be had that game, but that was it. And you saw that once, as I've talked about at the onset, Chris Chugunov came onto the field. There wasn't any way. West Virginia fans, myself included, were calling for defensive touchdowns because they felt as if they had absolutely no hope offensively. I think like Tyke Smith, it's either him or Kenny Robinson, it might have been Kenny Robinson, came away with some interception. It was like, if he can't get into field goal range, then this counts for nothing. Just because West Virginia's offense was so bad with Chris Chugunov in there. So, but you look at those numbers of 2017 for Grier, 64% completion percentage on 318 attempts, 3,490 passing yards, 34 touchdowns, did have 12 picks, and also had at that point in time positive rushing yards, 122 with 2 rushing touchdowns. Now, 2018, as we know, and we got a credit for him, 4th in Heisman voting. He was fantastic. But I felt as if Will Grier, with a new hairstyle included, heard the NFL draft evaluations and said he was too small for the NFL. So he put on weight to bulk up to get to that NFL, passing on the draft after the 2017 season, to come back for 2018, talk Sills into staying back for his senior year. And I mean, he lit the world on fire. 67, great passing, 67% completion percentage on 397 attempts, 3,864 yards with 37 touchdowns to just 8 interceptions for that year, and also had 3 rushing touchdowns. But we all know what happened. Unfortunately, West Virginia just got out-coached in that night game, led by a Brock Purdy, true freshman Iowa State team unveiling their new, all-black uniforms, and David Montgomery and co. just ran all over West Virginia. And the defense, I talked about this in my last video I made last week about defensive performances. Defense got owned up. And I'll still argue this, is that because that NC State game was canceled because of a hurricane in 2018, it didn't allow for West Virginia early on in the season to develop the kind of offensive continuity that it needed to then go into a road Big 12 contest, hostile environment at night, to go and get a victory. So, I'm not saying that as an excuse of why you lost to ISU. Defense predominantly. But offense, I feel like, could have countered better than they had. They did, had they played that NC State game, which would have been I think it was Ryan Finley, Will Grier contest on the road. In Morgantown, and would have been that would have prepared them better. So, but then, you get and have that unbelievable victory down in Austin. Call will be live in infamy by Gus Johnson, touchdown to Gary Jennings, and then the 2-point conversion successfully. Horns down Texas. But losses to Oklahoma State and Taylor Cornelius. Again, defense really hurt them there. But I've looked back on that last pass attempt on that final drive, and he missed a wide open Marcus Sims across the seam, or down in the slot. Would have walked in for the end zone. He was looking for Sills, tried to make something happen through it in the coverage, and it didn't work out. And then, of course, losing to Oklahoma the week later. In both of those contests, the fumbles by Greer really cost West Virginia. Losing out on a Big 12 title game. And then I think what put the ultimate sour taste in fans' mouths about Will Greer was that he opted out of the Pinstripe Bowl against Syracuse. I think everyone understood, why he was doing what he was doing, but it was the fun, new thing to do for all these guys who thought that they were going in the first to second round, is opting out of meaningless bowl games. That's when really this picked up steam because of Christian McCaffrey, and then others over the next couple of years, Greer falling in that same kind of mold. So I think if Greer could have done it, but then again, also I think that he was hurt. I think he got hurt in that Texas game. I don't think fans know much about this. I think he hurt his foot, and that's what cost his mobility in those Oklahoma State and Oklahoma games. And then by the time he was so beat up by that Pinstripe Bowl. So again, had he not put on as much weight as he could have been more mobile in 2018. Is it a little bit differently? I don't know. He was phenomenal. Excellent. Have his jersey. Loved the guy. Fantastic. Deserving of number 3. Number 2, I'm going Geno Smith. Took over as West Virginia's starting quarterback in the 2010 season, really spanning the end of the Bill Stewart era in 2010 into the Dana Holgorsen beginning, and they worked in tandem. The ascension that Geno Smith had can be attributed to Dana Holgorsen's air raid light 'em up offense, and Geno Smith was the perfect quarterback for that system. Looking at 2010 specifically, he went from 2,763 passing yards with a very respectable 24 touchdown to 7 interception ratio for a defensively led West Virginia team that managed its way to 9 wins. Despite losses to Syracuse and UConn. This was peak Jeff Mullen. And this is why ultimately Bill Stewart was, fired, in wanting to bring on Dana Holgorsen, but working on that coach in waiting that ultimately went nowhere. You had Noel Devine, you had Tavon Austin, Stedman Bailey, Geno Smith. I know that those 3 were just true sophomores at that point in time, but there was so much more to be had at that point in time when the Big 12, when UConn won the Big East that year and went and played in a BCS bowl game. So that's when Ken Kendrick and other boosters were pretty much and Oliver Luck especially was just chomping at the bit to find an heir apparent into this new era of the Big 12. So why he moved on to Dana Holgorsen. But then 2011 to 2012, 45, 90 passing yards, 73 touchdowns, and 13 picks. Also had 4 rushing touchdowns. We'll always remember the 70 to 33 victory led by Geno Smith, Tavon Austin, Stedman Bailey, and that WVU offense, and some standout players on the defensive side for that victory over the Tigers. He'll always have that to his credit. I think also maybe the most electric performance ever by a West Virginia quarterback, a game I was at, and I still think I have heart palpitations from that game, against Baylor at home. Smith having 656 passing yards and 8 touchdowns. 2011, I think arguably was his gutsiest performance of his career against number 2 LSU at home, which I think with 85 Oklahoma, also 2011 Alabama, 2011 LSU might have been the 3rd best defense ever in college football. Definitely, I think, is in the top 5 with Tyrann Mathieu on that, the Honey Badger. But then, 2011, losing at Syracuse, getting pummeled on a Friday night, 49-23, and then losing at home, 38-35, to a freshman-led Teddy Bridgewater for Louisville. We forget that Orange Bowl win. West Virginia had to win its last 3 games. Cincinnati, who was ranked, Pitt, South Florida, and get help to get the Big East automatic bid. And thankfully they did, because that changed everything for that for that program, coming out of the Rich Rodriguez days and then the ascension into Dana Holgerson's first season. Fell apart in 2012, mainly because of the defense and not having the quality depth, especially on the defensive side, to compete in the Big 12. It seemed as if Geno Smith, not just that Baylor game, but every game, if it wasn't for Geno Smith and that offense scoring touchdowns, not just field goals, touchdowns on just about every single possession, West Virginia was going to lose. Because you had Pat Miller and can't forget Broderick Jenkins also. Terrible corners. Just bad defense. Thank God for that offense, or it would have even been a worse year. But Geno Smith having all of those records, having the BCS Bowl victory, the statistics, take your pick who you want on any given day against any given opponent between Pat White, Geno Smith, Will Grier, and that's why I have him second best. Now number 1, pretty obvious. The great one, number 5 himself, that would be Pat White. Looking at his numbers, 6,049 passing yards, 4,480 rushing yards, graduated as the NCAA's leading rusher as a quarterback, 103 touchdowns, 23 picks, 2-time Big East, Player of the Year, 4-time bowl winner, the only college quarterback to win a bowl game 4 times, 2 of them being the BCS. Whether you thought the Orange Bowl or the Sugar Bowl was more meaningful, that's up for your own interpretation. White was fantastic in both of them. Slayton really stealing the show in that Sugar Bowl, but had it not been for Pat White coming onto the scene in that Louisville game, look at his total wins. And I'll just say West Virginia's total wins between 2005 to 2008. I know Adam Bednarik was the quarterback up until that Louisville game, so I can't necessarily credit White. But West Virginia 42-9 during that span, and again winning 4 bowl games, 2 BCS. But beyond the bowl wins, what I will remember from Pat White, in addition to just all of his highlight reel plays, of course that Louisville game in 2005. Maybe a turning point, I feel like I try to be as big of a historian of West Virginia football as anyone. So Major Harris and what he did into the 80s, or even going back further, Jeff Hostetler in the early 80s beating Oklahoma on the road in Norman. Then, of course, the Major Harris era. Then Mark Bulger, or the 93 team into the Mark Bulger era, spanning that in totality, the Don Nealon era into then the Rich Rodriguez. The turning points, games that you needed to win. Louisville was huge. It was such a watershed moment. Adam Bednarik getting hurt, going to Pat White, and him leading the charge and getting a victory. Huge for the trajectory of the program. But also beating Mississippi State in back-to-back years in 2006 and 2007. I think that's why, and also beating Auburn in 2008, 34-17. I think that's why some SEC fans have a shade of respect for West Virginia, is because the old-timers, I guess I'm an old-timer and older, remember Pat White and Steve Slayton and how good those teams were. And putting SEC speed. Also Georgia in 2005, putting SEC speed on display and them running the spread read option. Is they remember these teams. They remember the old gold and blue during that era and how good they were in comparison to some of the SEC's. Mississippi State wasn't best by any means, but pound for pound, West Virginia could play with all of those teams. So I think that's why there's a bit of a respect factor there. Kind of hanging on to that as we look into all the realignment that's going on is West Virginia, for so many reasons, that included, I feel like, the respect of Pat White and Steve Slayton. It has some SEC respect. But I would also say, looking at 2007, winning at a ranked Rutgers team in 31-3, just pummeling them, Also winning at Cincinnati. That was a tough game on the road, number 21 team, in really dominating fashion. I know it was 28-23, but I watched this game back about a few years ago. I think Cincinnati scored late to make it look closer than it was. It was just run all over Cincinnati all game long. And then the UConn game for the share of the Big East championship at that point in time, 66-21 ranked victory at home. Maybe the most complete performance I've seen out of a West Virginia team. I think guys, West Virginia was getting down to like its fourth and fifth string running backs even scoring touchdowns in that contest. And I already mentioned the Auburn game. So, I mean, I don't know what much more you can say about Pat White and what he means. And if you want to put him, you ask my dad, he's going to go Major Harris. You're going to ask me, I'm going to say Pat White because I didn't see Major Harris play in person. You might take Pat as a better runner than Major, but predominantly because he played out of a spread read option. And is there a better spread read option quarterback in the history of college football than Pat White? I don't know. I don't know about that. I'd take him pound for pound just about anybody running that offense. And tough, man. The hits that he would take, I know 07 not included, but I mean what he did against Pitt in 05 and 06, put on a highlight show. I mean, one of the most feared offenders in the history of the Big East Conference, put that conference on its back, and had it stuck together, it would have been because of guys like Pat White. So that's why I put him number one of the last 20 years, spanning 2003 to 2023. In totality, I know I'm coming up on an hour. Number one, Pat White. Number two, Geno Smith. Number three, Will Grier. Number four, Rasheed Marshall. Number five, Skylar Howard. Number six, Clint Trickett. Number seven, Jarrett Deggy. Number eight, Garrett Green. Number nine, Jarrett Brown. 10, JT Daniels. And 11, Austin Kendall. What do you think? Where do you think I'm wrong? Where would you argue with me? Or do you like that list? I know I kind of said some tiers, kind of some players' careers you could kind of put against each other. I'd say Kendall versus Daniels. In a vacuum, I'd say Trickett versus Skylar Howard. Would you go 1, 2, 3, White, Smith, Grier, or somebody else? I mean, do you like Rasheed Marshall over Will Grier? I want to hear your comments. If you like this video, please hit that like button, and I'm going to be doing a lot more videos here as we gear up for the college football season, talking about this 2024 team and what's happening. So love to have you as a subscriber on this channel. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your dog that I do this each and every week and have a lot of fun doing it. Thanks for tuning in. Hail West Virginia. Let's go.